Sweet, we are recording. Hello, Eleanor. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm very excited for this. Before we start, would you like to give a quick introduction to who you are, what you do?
Yep, sure. So I'm a DPhil student in environmental research at the School of Geography. And my research focuses mainly on tropical forests, trying to scale up fieldwork using drones and satellites.
That's awesome. Eleanor is also the co-founder of the Oxford Drone Society, which is very cool. We'll get onto drones later. Your research is really cool. So I'm really excited to learn more about this. So you work on trees? Yes,
mainly.
Right. Do you want to give a little bit more detail of your research?
Yes. So I mainly work in tropical forests. So scientists have been studying tropical forests for a long time. And the main way that you study a tropical forest is that you go out to somewhere like Brazil or Ghana or Borneo, and you delineate a field site, which is normally a hectare, about 100 meters by 100 meters. And you mark all the trees in that field site, you number them, you employ somebody to identify the species of that tree. You send tree climbers up that tree to cut down the branches.
Have you ever been a tree climber?
I haven't been a tree climber.
So you normally have a team of tree climbers?
But I have been on a team with tree climbers.
That's huge. Cool.
And often these trees are very, very tall and the tree climbers don't use any safety equipment. So it can be quite terrifying watching them climb the tree.
Right.
In Ghana, actually my tree climber would pray next to each tree before he climbed it. He would pray that his rope didn't break, that he didn't meet any snakes. And sometimes you do look at them and think, is this research really worth it?
Right. What am I doing?
Exactly.
Why am I the one who gets
Yes. So these branches are cut down. You collect some leaf samples. You might collect some bark samples, some soil samples, some root samples. And then these are taken back to the lab for analysis later. And of course, all of this is very time consuming. It's very labor intensive. It's very expensive. And then you get the results, 2 or 3 months down the line back from the lab. And then you have results for a very small patch of forest.
And it's destructive, right? So you've got rid of that patch of forest before.
Exactly. Well, the trees still stand, but it is destructive. You have chopped down some branches. And of course, often with long-term monitoring sites, these data are taken every month or every year. For over decades in some cases. But of course, you don't know if this patch of forest is really representative of the wider forest ecosystem around you. You don't know if you were to repeat these experiments just 100 meters down the road if you would get the same results. So what I work on is trying to use new technologies to scale up these field measurements over much wider areas.
So what sort of things are you trying to measure?
So it varies. I work mainly on leaves. Leaves obviously are quite an important part of a tropical forest ecosystem. They kind of drive carbon cycling. So they're the layer of the forest that interacts with the atmosphere. So I work on climate vegetation interactions and how tropical forests might be influencing climate change and also how they might be influenced by climate change. So I look at the chemical constitutions of the leaves, the thickness of the leaves, and the photosynthesis and respiration rate of the leaves.
You were saying, we were talking about this a couple of days ago. You said like a really simple equation that just sort of summed up the whole thing.
Yes.
I can't remember what it was.
Well, carbon absorption. So I look at carbon absorption as well across tropical forests. And carbon absorption is simply how much carbon a tree is sucking in from the atmosphere. So tropical forests actually only cover 7% of the world's land surface, but they absorb 18% of human CO2 emissions. And carbon absorption is simply a tree's photosynthesis rate, so how much carbon it's sucking in from the atmosphere, minus its respiration rate. So respiration is kind of like a tree's breathing, so how much carbon it's then breathing back out into the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think that the focus on sort of trees and carbon dioxide almost always goes to deforestation. But if you look in the numbers, the actual like percentage area of deforestation is actually quite small. And so I'm guessing if you look into it, it's actually this like productivity of the rest of the photosynthesis process that really matters.
Yeah, exactly. So of course, deforestation is a huge problem in tropical forests. But my work doesn't look so much at trees being chopped down and how that affects carbon, but it looks at trees becoming more productive under climate change. So just like if you were to put a plant in a greenhouse and you were to increase the CO2 and you were to increase the temperature.
And this is what it's done. Like greenhouses have massive CO2 concentrations.
Exactly. That plant would grow faster and it would become more productive and it would suck in more carbon dioxide. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing to the world at the moment.
Right.
Pumping it full of CO2, increasing the temperature. And we're seeing tropical forests becoming more productive at the moment. And at the moment, sucking in more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
But you give the example of a greenhouse, which is a very controlled, like small, closed system that you can really tightly monitor. Is the world like that at all? Or is it complex, non-linear?
Of course, it is complex and nonlinear. And at the moment, the increased CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is probably benefiting tropical forests on the whole. But of course, the question is, maybe are we going to reach a tipping point where maybe the nutrients in the soil can't keep up with this increased productivity because we're not fertilizing the soils as you might be doing in a greenhouse. And maybe precipitation may become a limiting factor. With warmer climates, also they tend to be drier. And we have seen some quite extraordinary droughts, especially across the Amazon over the last 20 years.
There's quite a lot of stuff happening on Siberia at the moment, I think. This isn't something I know a lot about, but I think there's some quite odd temperature waves that are happening across Siberia at the moment.
Yes, in the Arctic, actually, we're seeing fires where we've never seen fires before.
That's crazy. So you've been to the Arctic?
Yes, I have.
What was that like?
It was a once in a lifetime experience, I would say. So my work mainly revolves around tropical forests, but the technology we use can be applied to any ecosystem: savannas, grasslands, tundra. So 2 years ago, I was in Svalbard, which is 74 degrees north. So if you go to the very top of Norway and keep going across the sea, then you hit Svalbard.
And is it frozen at that point, or is it's still ocean, but just very, very, very cold?
The sea ice varies across the year. So in the winter, there's a lot of sea ice, but in the summer, a lot of that has melted.
Okay, yeah. Wow. Okay, did you have like coats and like layers and?
So we went in the summer, and actually it was surprisingly not that cold. And most days the temperature was a few degrees above freezing. So quite similar to a British winter.
A nice British winter.
Exactly.
But that's the summer.
Yes, that's the summer.
That's crazy. So you talked about the technology that can map everything.
Yes.
So we haven't gone into that yet. So you work on drones and mapping. How does that work?
Yes. So I use infrared cameras to map things that are difficult to see with your eye. So infrared light is light that our eyes can't see, but it contains a treasure trove of chemical and biological information. So basically the sun shines on a tropical forest tree, and a lot of that light is absorbed by the tree for processes such as photosynthesis. But some of that light is reflected. For example, trees reflect a lot in green light. That's why they look green to us. But they also reflect very strongly in infrared light. And that's light that our eyes can't see, but you can pick it up using an infrared camera.
So it's like having light, but can see colours beyond the colours.
Exactly. And you can analyze that infrared light to derive chemical and biological information about the leaves on a tree that you just couldn't tell with your eyes. So
and this is something we do in like material science, for example, all the time. We take a material, we shine various wavelengths of light at it, and then we see what the signal you get back is.
Yeah, precisely.
So that's cool. So comparing it to the previous situation where you've got a load of tree climbers who are going up and cutting down a number of leaves and so on, and then taking that sample, and you've got a really small area. How does that compare to what you can do now with drones?
Well, drones are really expanding these field measurements.
When did this sort of start? What was the sort of period that this started, the whole drone thing?
Well, so we've known since the 60s that you can use infrared light to derive chemical information about a leaf. It's called spectroscopy, and it's actually a very well-known and studied technique in chemistry and physics and biology. But what's where the technology has advanced is being able to take these spectrometers, which are incredibly big, heavy pieces of equipment, and miniaturize them so that they're small and light enough to fit them on a drone, and then fly them over the top of the tropical forest canopies.
So it's not the drone technology; it's almost the camera sensor technology.
Exactly,
that's
changed. It's both.
Right.
It's the drone, but also the camera technology, which has really advanced in the last 10 years.
We've seen it in films that you've got, I guess, Attenborough is the obvious example. You used to have a helicopter to capture these things, and now we're looking at drones. And if you take Attenborough as an example, you've gone from having to fly a helicopter, you're never going to catch a lion or a tiger or so on, whereas now you can take a drone, fly it overhead and see loads of stuff.
Yes.
I mean, trees aren't going to run away because there's a helicopter, but you can imagine it would be much, much harder to do and much more expensive and so on.
Yes, and actually, there's a group in the States, and they were at California. I think they've now just moved to Arizona, headed by someone called Greg Asner, and he has a plane which has very advanced spectrometers on it, and he's mapped the whole of Peru for chemicals across the tropical forest, which is incredible.
As you do.
But
that speaks to the sort of areas that you can actually access if you use this technology from the air, right?
Yes. But of course, not everybody has his plane. As a researcher, as a PhD student, I don't have access to this incredible plane. So what we're trying to do is make this technology cheaper and more affordable to your average researcher who could actually buy a drone off the shelf and learn how to fly it and then map their local woodland or their local patch of tropical forest.
Yeah. And I know you, a little while, because Eleanor and I are good friends, and we talked about this before. She was very, very happy one day because there was some software that could take all of her drone maps and then stitch it all together automatically.
Yes.
And there were some new students that didn't appreciate, just saw us like, oh yeah, that's cool. That's sort of, and you were like, no, this is the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, exactly. So the drone takes multiple images, and then you have to try.
It rasters, right? It almost rasters over.
Yes, exactly. So it takes multiple overlapping images, and then at the end of a drone flight, you have a folder with 1,000 images or something, and you have to stitch them all together and try and work out which images are overlapping with which.
And that was a laborious job of a PhD.
Exactly, that's quite difficult, but there are now very impressive programs out there which can do it automatically for you.
That's what you want.
Exactly.
So let's look longer term in your research. Are drones the end goal, or are you looking to?
No, so we're trialing this technology using drones because drones are quite sophisticated pieces of software, and the cameras that they have on them are quite sophisticated. But ultimately, you can't map a tropical forest using a drone. So ultimately, we're trying to scale up what we do with drones and try and use satellites. And people think of satellites as being these very sophisticated instruments out in space, and they are.
The cost of putting one up there is
astronomical. And they are the pinnacle of human endeavor in some ways. But in other ways, at least the satellites that have free imagery that we can use for free actually have cameras that aren't so sophisticated as the ones that we can put on our drones. And
they can't be updated as quickly.
Exactly. So the satellites I'm using have cameras that are less sophisticated than the cameras I use on my drone. But they do have the advantage that they have imagery from across the whole
And they have a much
tropics.
wider, field of view.
Yes, so the resolution isn't as good. So using my drone, I can often see individual leaves themselves. The spatial resolution is about 2 to 3 centimeters, whereas the best resolution we have from a satellite that we can access is about 10 meters by 10 meters.
Which is a number of trees.
Exactly. That's the smallest pixel size. Yes, and other pixel sizes are about 25 meters by 25 meters, ranging up to 500 meters by 500 meters.
Right. And you can do some stuff to go sub-pixel with software and so on. So what's the plan? You get this super high resolution local data. Are you then trying to map that onto bigger picture data, or are you trying to prove it as proof of concept and then try and justify a high resolution camera? What's the...
Yes, so the plan is that to test out these methods using very high resolution, sophisticated cameras and drones, and then if that fails, there's not much point going to the satellite level.
No, right.
But hopefully if that succeeds, which it is proving that it will, then the plan is to scale up.
Congratulations.
Thank you. My PhD will be in jeopardy if it didn't. Is to scale up then using satellites. And then, of course, when we have these satellite maps, then we can validate them using this high resolution drone imagery.
And this isn't just CO2, right? So presumably you're collecting lots of different data points from this spectral map.
Yes, so we're looking at, for example, the nitrogen concentrations in the leaves, which correlates very, very well with photosynthesis, phosphorus in leaves, calcium in leaves, as well as photosynthesis and respiration rates, and ultimately carbon absorption.
And all of this is open access.
Yes.
All right. So presumably it's a huge data set that you're collecting.
Yes.
And so then that's things that loads of people can do analysis on.
Yes, exactly. So any of the global layers that we produce will be open access. So other scientists can download them themselves and look at their area of interest and see what the nitrogen concentration is or what the phosphorus concentration is for the area that they're interested in.
I find open access science so interesting. Like this idea that you just sort of put all your data out there is, yeah, and there's initiatives within materials where people do loads of calculations and just publish it on these sort of central databases. And it just seems the sensible way to go, right? And it's hard for some subjects because they're not specialized, but that seems to be the way to go.
Yes, and actually the technology that we're using has been developed and advanced by ecologists. And I know that quite a few of them have received quite lucrative offers from industry and from commercial partners to commercialize their software,
right, for sure,
and their technology. And they've actually turned it down because they think that answering these bigger questions about the world's tropical forests and ecosystems is more important to human endeavor than.
And it gives it a certain immunity from like political influence as well, because if you look at deforestation, for example, that's something that there's strong incentives for certain countries to report, and it's all reported on the state level. Whereas if you have open source, open access, no profit being made, scientists doing it, in all our naivety, then you end up with actual data that you can point to.
Yes.
Which is very cool. I mean, we'll see what happens, whether it fits the models or if it doesn't, and so on. In terms of like other things that people can see, you mentioned in the build up to the show that there's some stuff happening with Mayan temples and this data. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes. So this is an interesting application of what I do. So across parts of Central America, there used to be the Mayan civilization, especially concentrated in Mexico, Belize, Guatemala. And many of the temples and pyramids and dwelling places that they used to inhabit have been left behind and now covered in tropical forest. And many of those cities have been discovered, but actually there is still many left in the forest that is still covered with tropical forest that we don't know exist. And they're still being discovered at quite a high rate every year.
So I went to Machu Picchu, and I can completely understand how this happens. So it was Machu Picchu, for anyone who hasn't been there, I'm not sure if you have.
No, I haven't.
So you sort of get there and you drive across like a very, very dangerous road, or you can pay like 400 quid to take a train. Take a train, it's much safer. We almost died when we did it. Like it's sheer cliffs, like, rivers and so on. And then you walk for like many, many hours, and then you get to the base of a very, very steep mountain. And it's something like 1.2 kilometers, and it's all staircases. And so you can imagine before the staircase and the road, you can pay a minibus, but again, we were stingy.
Yes.
1.2 kilometers of vertical cliffs. And then on the top, there's sort of a plateau. And on that is Machu Picchu.
Yes.
You can fully understand how you would just never go there.
Yeah, completely. And in one of these instances, somebody flew a drone equipped with something called LiDAR, which isn't something that I work with, but it can map 3D structures underneath the canopy cover of a tropical forest.
So it's like radar, right? Radar, you send out radio waves, you time how long they take to get back, you get a distance.
It's exactly like that. It just shoots out electrons and you time how long they take to come back to map the structures below. And they flew this over quite a relatively small area of Guatemalan forest. And they discovered over 1,000 buildings, a 7-story pyramid and a hilltop fortress that archaeologists who've been working in the area for decades had never found. And from this, they realized actually how much was lying underneath the forest. The archaeologists just hadn't come across yet.
Right.
So one application of my research is that the trees and the plants that grow on these temples and on these pyramids. Obviously, they're on quite a different substrate compared to if they were growing in the surrounding forest. They're not really growing in soil, they're kind of growing in rock, in which case we'd expect their leaves to be a lot drier, and you'd expect them not to have access to the same nutrients as if you were growing in soil. So you'd expect their leaves...
It's like a patio.
Exactly, yeah. Trees growing on rocks are quite different species as well. So you'd expect not only their species to be different, but for them to have much lower nutrient concentrations in their leaves and to have much drier leaves. So if you had a system, for example, like a drone, which could map an area of forest.
Hypothetically. If you were working on a PhD,
which looked at precisely these leaf traits, then you could map an area of forest, and you could maybe find hotspots where the leaf traits were different to the surrounding forest. And maybe,
is this your secret plan to get rich after your DPhil? To go map loads of old temples and discover a giant pot of gold?
Yeah, basically become a 21st century Indiana Jones. Then you could discover these hotspots, which may suggest a Mayan pyramid underneath. And of course, it may not be practical to do it with a drone, but with satellites, you could cover vast areas of forest which are quite impenetrable to humans a lot of the time.
No, that's so cool. And it doesn't just... A main example is a beautiful example, but you're saying there that effectively what the plant grows in it also determines what plant grows.
Yes.
And so presumably you could map soil compositions and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Using the plants as a proxy.
Yes. Leaves often reflect the underlying soil conditions. Where you have high nutrient soils, you tend to have high nutrient leaves. I mean, that makes sense.
Makes sense.
And we have very poor soil maps of tropical forests at the moment. So updating those soil maps is another application of this research.
And these are all things like if you sort of envisage science and it starts off with the sort of person in their conservatory and they sort of measure electricity and so on. It starts off with simpler things, and then you end up now with science being a huge behemoth that consumes like a significant percentage of GDP. I've always sort of envisaged when I was younger that there would be endless data about everything, and basically we'd have measured everything. And this is, I think, an example of us moving towards that, where we actually know, in theory, in 50, 100 years or so on, the composition of soils in like lots of the Amazon, or how much nitrogen is in a leaf in, X bit of...
Yeah, and these are things that we don't know. This is the kind
but they're only now useful. Like, that's not useful to a Victorian.
That's true.
but today it could be, and it informs policy, right? That's going to inform some of our energy choices.
Yes, so that's the end goal of all of this. Is not just knowledge for knowledge's sake, or not just kind of pushing the unexplored frontier because we can. But the ultimate goal is to look at how will tropical forests respond to climate change. And also how will they influence climate change? And that can influence policies directly surrounding tropical forests or indirectly surrounding tropical forests.
But it's not just climate change. I mean, if you let's say you had a polluting factory that was emitting loads of whatever element, and then you could measure an increase in that element in the spectrograph of your satellite data, then that could inform policy for reducing pollution and so on.
Yes, exactly.
As we had that with water, and everyone's like, why are you measuring water? But this idea of an early warning system is really interesting. Take the example of climate change, there's this risk of a tipping point.
Yes. Currently tropical forests absorb around 18% of human CO2 emissions, which I've already said. But we don't know if that's going to continue to be the case.
Sure.
Under a drier world.
Double.
Exactly. I mean, it could increase, and at the moment we are seeing it increasing. But there's a worry that we're gonna hit a limit. And it might start to decrease. And even a decrease of a few percentages or a few percentage points would lead to billions of tons of CO2.
It's something like 30% of the globe is covered of land area is covered in forests. And you were saying 7% is tropical forests. 7% is
tropical forests. Even a small change in this 18% would lead to billions of tons of CO2 either remaining in the atmosphere or being sucked out of the atmosphere with important policy implications. So using satellites, if we could develop some kind of map of global tropical forest carbon absorption, then we could sort of monitor tropical forests and see if we were approaching a tipping point.
So when it stops uptaking
Yes.
CO2. And so you wouldn't have to wait a year, 2 years, 3 years to see a statistical change in the CO2 measurements.
Yes.
You could actually see locally.
Yes.
No, that's very cool. And you also get CO2 isn't, I was interested in this earlier, I had a look at a map. CO2 isn't just completely uniformly distributed in the atmosphere. So if you Google CO2 concentration, you get like 405 ppm. And that's increased loads since 150%, I think, since pre-industrial levels. But it's obviously highly concentrated around the emitting cities.
Yes.
So you can map, let's take this city and with this rainforest, and then you can see, at this really high concentration.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Let's move on to drones.
Okay.
Let's go back onto like nice steady ground and away from climate change where no one understands all of it. Tell me about drones. You obviously love them. You're the co-founder of Oxford Drone Society.
Yes, I own my own drone.
What got you into drones?
Well, actually, when I went to the Arctic 2 years ago, that was the first time that I flew drones. And I just enjoyed it so much that I came back and thought, I'm going to buy my own drone.
Right.
And,
saved up.
Yes. And I went on a course for PhD students to teach them how to fly drones. And there I met another friend who is also a PhD student at Oxford. And we decided that we would found the Oxford Drone Society together. Because there are lots of people in universities that use drones in all sorts of different areas, not just ecology. So in zoology, as we mentioned, there's a lot of drone use there. Also in volcanology, it's a really safe way of trying to collect gas emissions from volcanoes. So when...
Right, you can't like dangle a PhD student on a wire.
Yeah,
a little
exactly.
test tube.
Exactly. You can't kind of go up there when a volcano is erupting and stick a test tube in and try and capture what gases are coming out.
Right.
And of course, these are things that people don't really know the answer to. I mean, what actually comes out of a volcano when it erupts? But
there's a reason people don't know the answer to them.
Because it's quite dangerous. But now you can fly drones through. And of course, you have quite a high mortality rate of your drones when you do this. But even if a few come out the other side, you've got an incredible data set.
Have you ever crashed a drone?
Yes, I have. Don't
worry, the person whose drone it was probably won't listen to this, so you're okay.
I hope not. I've never, I don't think, fatally crashed a drone. I have crashed some drones.
They're quite robust.
They're surprisingly robust, actually. I crashed a drone in the Arctic. Well, we crashed a drone in the Arctic against the rock face. And a few screwdrivers later, and a bit of DIY, and it flew again.
So there's a lot of people, you talk about DIY, there's a lot of people who are now sort of trying to DIY drones. So
yes.
they're actually quite simple. You've got, gyroscopes and so on. I'm not saying they're easy, but they're at a point now where people are, actually DIYing them and using them for filmmaking and so on.
Yeah, they're very simple constructs. I mean, you've got, when a quadcopter, which is a drone that has 4 propellers, you've got 4 motors. And to go forwards, it's just the back 2 motors work more, which pushes the drone forwards.
So drones, like, I guess the question I have is like, why now? Like, what's happened recently with drones as well? Mavic have got DJI, a company that produced loads of drones recently.
Yeah, they own the majority of the market.
Right. So, but that's a fairly recent thing. You sort of have YouTube coming up, and then YouTubers suddenly all started to have drone shots in all their videos. Like, why do you think it's all started to happen now?
I think probably because of how inexpensive drones have become. I mean, the DJI drones are incredibly good quality,
right,
and incredibly competitively priced. So drones aren't much more expensive, or they're quite comparatively priced to your sort of handheld camera that you might buy nowadays.
Right.
And they have similar quality lenses and similar quality cameras on them.
You can get a really good one for like under £1,000.
Yes, exactly.
The cheap ones, the little Spark for like 500 odd.
Oh, the Spark's cheaper than that.
Is it? Wow.
100 or 200.
Need to get one.
Yeah, so I think that's why, really. People have realized that for the same price as having a handheld camera, you could have a camera that flies.
So I work in batteries, and I think that I'm always like, yeah, it's because of the battery technology. And I think that's part of it, that they've, the energy density's gone up. You can power, as you say, you can make it fly for at least 20, 30 minutes of flight.
Yeah, so batteries is a big part of it. That's the limiting factor to drones at the moment.
Is the energy...
Yes, is basically just trying to keep it up in the air for as long as possible, which is all down to the battery technology. I mean, the majority of a weight of a drone is its battery.
Right. Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, and the motors are quite heavy as well. Motors aren't light.
Yes.
But yeah, I think this is going to. Of course, I love batteries, and then I think I reduce everything to batteries. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely the biggest problem with drones.
Yeah,
because it's really hard to make something that flies.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of power to keep those propellers spinning around.
I was just reading about the Wright Brothers when they started flying, and there was loads and loads of like really rich people who kept on trying to make things fly, and so they'd arrange huge audiences, and then they'd sort of try and fly, and they'd always employ someone to be the person that flied the thing. They never fly themselves. These things would just flop straight out of the air. Or shoot straight upwards, stall, and then come straight back down again.
Yes.
So it's actually really difficult to make something fly. And drones, I guess, now seem so cheap and so easy. So do you see them still improving? Like, do you see drones as getting much, much better year on year?
Definitely. I think two issues, well, one we've already talked about is the fact that they do only fly for 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
It limits your image size.
Yeah, it massively limits your image size.
What is your image size right now, roughly? How many kilometers squared?
We don't talk in kilometers squared. It depends how high you fly, of course, because the higher you fly, then the more area you can capture. But then, of course, the lower your resolution is. Yeah,
and it's not. Is it area captured? If you flew really high, you can still only travel the same difference sideways, right? You're capturing more in a single image.
Yes.
But then I guess you need to fly really quickly, stop, take your image. Fly really quickly, stop.
Yes, exactly.
I'm trying to think this through.
So I can normally capture about a hectare, 100 meters by 100 meters in about 20-25 minutes.
Which is what used to take a team of tree climbers that you had on your roster.
6 weeks to
6 weeks to do.
To do, exactly.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And no one would ever think, oh, look, I've invented a drone. And then think, oh, you know what this is going to be really helpful for?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ecologists are kind of taking technology that's been invented for entertainment reasons.
Sure.
And applying it
for Attenborough to capture his leopard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other issue with drones is noise at the moment.
Yes.
So they're still quite noisy. I'm sure if ever you've been on a nice walk in the countryside, and you've heard something that sounds like a swarm of bees.
It's the most beautiful. I was in Cornwall. Most beautiful picturesque sunset you've ever seen. Just sunsetting, everything orange. It's gorgeous. What do I hear?
Yeah, and I just recently did a study with a friend where we looked at the noise of a drone from different meters away from it. And we went up to how far away you're allowed to fly a drone away from you. It was about 120 meters. And then we compared the noise recordings to the hearing ranges of different animals. And even if you were to fly a drone as high up in the air as you were legally allowed to, practically every single animal would still know it was there.
Would still know it was there. Well, there we go. But it doesn't destroy your leaves as a helicopter would.
No, it doesn't.
And it's much better than a helicopter.
Yes, much more environmentally
And they
friendly.
go quite quick as well. They've got quite a clock to them, a drone. You can get them to go really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So where do you see, I guess, are there any improvements to a drone that would really make a difference to your research? Like, what would you, if you could envisage the next DJI, whatever, Inspire 7, what would you want it to have that it doesn't yet have?
Well, for my research, I'd like it to fly for up to an hour. And also, it's not so much the drone, but the camera. So at the moment, drones, we can hold cameras that maybe can capture 100 pieces of information. So most pictures...
And that's what spectral resolution?
Yes, exactly. So most cameras that you would use are RGB, red, green, blue, which is 3 pieces of information. And our cameras can go up to about 100. But of course, the more pieces of information you have, the more accurate you can make your measurements.
Right.
So if we
spectral things aren't necessarily, they're often peaks, at least I'm not sure what it's like in the infrared. But
yes.
Am I right in thinking they're often peaks and not broad?
They're often peaks, and it's often very narrow peaks and troughs, which is what you use to make your measurements.
And the width of those peaks is useful as well.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, the more pieces of information you had and the more accurately you could draw those peaks and troughs.
It's like if you just saw in black and white. If you just had like 2 data points, the world would be pretty weird.
Yeah. So I would say that the best improvement would be cheaper cameras that had more pieces of information.
So I just got an iPhone 6 because my Galaxy S8 broke. And it's incredible how quickly cameras are progressing.
Yes.
Right? The photos are terrible. I almost don't share them. And that's happening as much in the commercial camera space as it is, I guess as it is on the phones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And drones with hyperspectral cameras are becoming more widespread, but they're still very expensive. And what would really improve this field even more would be a hyperspectral satellite.
What I'm dreaming of is a satellite with just infinite resolution that just takes a photo of the Earth.
That would be perfect. At the moment,
constantly updates it.
The only open access satellites that we have are only multispectral. So the most numbers of pieces of information they have is about 13, which is Sentinel, which is the European Space Agency satellite.
A collaborator of yours?
Yes.
No, that's very cool. I actually applied to be an astronaut at the ESA once.
Did you?
Yeah, I watched The Martian. This is when I was young and naive. I watched The Martian, and I was like, that sounds really cool. And then I sort of looked like, what are the requirements for an astronaut after I'd applied? It turns out to be an astronaut is really, really hard. Like you have to have like multiple PhDs. You basically have to be like a whole team of like incredibly intelligent people. They obviously can't, there's not enough weight capacity to send up,
just one person.
Just one person. So you need to have the qualifications of like 7 people.
How did the application go?
I mean, I had nothing back. But I enjoyed for like a day being, an astronaut applicant. I still don't think I've actually surpassed that as an achievement. I actually feel quite bad for wasting their gigabytes on their email server.
Maybe after you have your PhD, you can reapply.
Perhaps, yeah. How can you show that you're dedicated to this role? Well, I can't believe I just said that. That's really embarrassing. But yeah, satellite's cool. And it looks like the cost of putting a satellite in space is decreasing. I don't think it's going to be something that's necessarily accessible to a PhD budget, but you can envisage a government program that wants to tackle, a certain issue and so on, being able to in future put up a satellite and so on to do that.
Well, there are commercial hyperspectral satellites. It's just that to buy imagery for the whole of the tropics across the world is far out of any researcher's budget.
And it's not open source, as you say. You'd have conflicts of interest and so on. Yeah. Amazing. So we have covered a huge amount. We've started at CO2 and global warming. We've gone through to drones and mapping the Amazon. We've discussed Mayan pyramids, and we've discussed your experiencing what was quite a warm winter day in the Arctic. Yeah. Would you go there in winter or not?
Yeah, I definitely would.
You would?
It's quite sad that we didn't get to go on a sleigh ride across the tundra, pulled by huskies.
Pulled by a load of huskies. That is the dream. Well, we'll call it there, I reckon, unless you've got something else you want to add.
No, that's it from me.
Amazing, cool. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack.
Bye.